Hello, everyone.
Hello, and welcome to LoFi History.
Yes, this is our first Lo-Fi history of 2021.
We made it.
So, yeah, we made it. So, I got
You'll jinx it.
yeah, right. I got a fresh, sweet beat for us. And we've also got some cool costumes for Marie and Glenn, at least. I'll be the uncool one behind the scenes. I tried sunglasses, but it didn't work for the screen, so I won't be as cool as you guys.
Yeah.
Alas. Well,
Turns out that big-time movie producers can't wear sunglasses while working.
yeah, that's me. I'm the big-time movie producer. Well, welcome, everyone. Yes, this is Lo-Fi History, so if you're just joining us for Lo-Fi History, this is your chance to ask historians, Glenn and Marie, any question that you want. We start out with a specific topic each week, and this week we're going to be diving into a little bit of World War II, but any history question is up for grabs, so just chat your history questions for Glenn and Marie in the chat, and I will see them, and we'll get them answered to the best of our lovely historians' abilities. But,
Such as they are.
Such as they are. So, Marie, let's start with you. So I love the hairdo, by the way.
Thank you.
That is a classic curl. I'm all about it.
You can see straight through it.
Yes, that's that was the goal, right?
Yes, it was.
So Marie, can you sort of give us what was going on with fashion in the 40s, and did it change because of World War II?
Oh, yes, because the fabric was being rationed. You had certain materials like nylon, which was being used for the front. I think it was being used for particularly parachutes.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of women almost always wore pantyhose, but 1940s pantyhose were gone because nylon's a very large part of pantyhose. And now what are women to do with bare legs? They're bare-legged. So there is actually some historical documentation of because during this time pantyhose would have a seam up the back, which some still do today, but some don't. But women sometimes they would like draw a line up the back of their legs to make it look like they were still wearing pantyhose.
It was that important
wow.
to look like you still had pantyhose on.
Oh, wow.
If you didn't, because pantyhose, as we know, they get torn pretty easily. But some people would still have old ones that they would try to make do and make last as long as possible. You have fabric shortages. You have your, depending on where you are, so many ration tickets for fabric in your ration booklet. So the 30s, it's always interesting. Hemlines, even to this day, they swing back and forth to be more conservative and more showy. The 30s kind of had a longer hemline. They went down. 20s went way up, and then the 30s came back down. And then the 40s, they rose a little bit because it's less fabric. You're using less fabric. You don't have as much fabric. More fabric is needed for making uniforms and such. So skirts, they're not full by any means. They're pretty just like, and this is a dress. They're not using that much fabric. Hemlines have gone up. Hairstyles were still like a really big thing. Makeup was still a big thing. A lot of it, Victory Red was huge. Nail polish, lipstick, which would show your patriotism to America, and dedication to winning the war. So that was a very big color in the color scheme of fashion. Hairstyles like this is like sometimes I think it's called a victory roll. So again, victory is like, like a lot of the different fashion things. And this was really popular. Hairstyles with a little bit more height. And then they would kind of like come down here in the back. I have a bun because I just have too much hair. But they would usually be like kind of short and more of an updo. And that was still a thing that even some ladies who were going into factory and working still wanted to, look nice and feminine.
Beauty was their duty, as the saying went.
And do their hair and makeup, even if they were going into work in a factory.
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, but when they were doing all those fantastic hairstyles from the 40s, this is definitely pre-hairspray days. Especially during the war. Yeah, I mean they're having to do it with curlers and 1,000 bobby pins and things like that. it's an art form in and of itself.
It really is. It really is. Hairstyling is definitely.
And I think, maybe I'm biased, but I think that those 40s hairstyles are some of the prettiest, best hairstyles in American history. They're just, they're fantastic.
Oh yeah, they're so much fun.
Oh yeah, and little hats.
Yes,
Little
hats.
I see Fried is with us. Hello, Fried.
Hi.
Welcome back. Fried says Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
So, and yes, Happy New Year to everyone. So if you're just joining us a little bit late, we are talking about World War II, but we're going to talk about World War II and what Glenn and Marie are wearing. If you have any questions specifically about World War II, feel free to chat them. Or if you have history questions in general, we are also here to help you with those as well. Now, Glenn, talk to us about what you are wearing today.
Yes, I won't go too much into it because we have a segment on this Sunday's Family Day where I'm going to go into some details on American infantry uniforms during the war. But just briefly, I have on this. It's kind of a snazzy jacket. This is the M41 Field Jacket, jacket, field, OD, as they would say. And it's got this nice lapel, and it's actually based on a civilian sport coat pattern. And literally, not like, suit sport coat, but literal outdoor sport coat. It's got, some lapels that can come up, the collar can come up. It's got a thin wool lining inside of it, and it comes just to your waist. And this was the Army's effort to try to have something that could still look good and soldierly, but still be practical in the field. Remember, this is before World War II. It's a peacetime army, and historically speaking, peacetime armies are not that good at fighting. They're good at spit and polish and nice, clean, straight, starched uniforms that look good. And so they adopted this as sort of an in-between. And it would be very common to have a tie with this ensemble, with a wool shirt, a tie, this coat, and some sort of service cap. But when the war starts, soldiers in the field are not that spit and polish. They're going to do what's comfortable, what's practical. So this coat soldiers on until late 43, and in some places it takes until post-Normandy, post-summer 44, to get the newer uniforms into everyone's hands. So this is sort of that classic GI look. The generals tended to hate this coat because, again, it didn't look soldierly. Now, I also have on this cap. This is technically called a helmet liner, a wool helmet liner, because it's designed, it's like it's a toboggan, right? It's got this little bill here that's just a cardboard insert, and it's got the side things that you can flip down over your ears and keep your ears warm or put them up. Most people recognize this particular piece of headgear because it's what radar always wore on MASH, right?
Yep.
It is an incredibly comfy and warm piece of headgear, but a lot of the officers, especially the generals, hated it because it is not very soldierly. It is not very spit and polish. It's very comfy and a very practical garment, but they hated it because this was not supposed to be worn without the helmet. Right? This was not supposed to be your headgear, but so many guys wore it because it was comfy, it stretched to fit, all the things. So I've worn it as a protest against spit and polish and to be very, very comfortable today. And again, as I've said before, Southerners overreact when the weather's cold. And it is down to nearly 50 degrees here.
Nearly 50 degrees.
How are we going to live?
I don't know.
That's basically freezing in Georgia.
It's basically
It might
freezing.
Yeah.
I'm going to get some bread and milk on the way home, just to be sure.
Better.
Just to be sure.
Ava is with us. Hey, Ava. And Ava says, you guys, your shades are awesome. So, yeah, I agree. I'm a little jealous that I can't wear mine. Fried, let's see, says, earlier today, a British friend asked me, his token German friend, me, to discuss and evaluate the political system of the Weimar Republic.
The Weimar Republic,
Does
yes.
Glenn have an opinion on that? Sounds like you might.
I do have an opinion, and this is my opinion. I don't know if you want to jump in on this.
I'm not sure
think
what it is.
So we have. Let us go back to almost the beginning.
Oh, wow.
There is World War I,
Yes.
which is a German government under the Kaiser, which is predominantly run by the Junkers, or the German aristocracy from Prussia, right? It's a very complex system. The Kaiser theoretically is the sovereign. He's the king, the head of state. World War I happens, and he has to resign because there is a quasi-revolution in Germany at the end of the war. They don't want that system anymore because it hasn't done very well for them, right? They lost the war. They have to sign the Treaty of Versailles, and a government has gone in place. Long story short, there is a republic set up after World War I, and it's called the Weimar Republic. I believe it's called that because isn't that the town, I think, where the Constitution for that particular form of government was adopted, and it was the government. It was much closer to what we here in the United States have than what they had before, right? There's an elected body. There are theoretically separations of powers and things like that. And I find myself sometimes being an apologist for the Weimar Republic because it is in a situation that it is practically impossible to succeed or get out of, right? It's post-World War I. Germany is under the edicts of the Treaty of Versailles, which means their army can't be very big. They're having to pay impossible reparations to the Allies, especially Britain and France. There's no way they can raise this money. They're trying to maintain order. There are all sorts of internal conflicts because of the economic situation. And then the Depression hits, right? We get the Depression here in the U.S., and they get the Depression over there too, only it's worse because of their situation. And Germany is economically in a horrible, difficult, nearly impossible to get out of situation. And the Weimar Republic does, I think, the best that it can with the hand that it's been dealt to try to rectify the situation. But it's nearly impossible. And because that situation is so bad, people start looking for other people who may have answers. And they start turning into a lot of different directions. They look at, traditional German forms of government, maybe a throwback to the Kaiser. They start looking at Communist Party, and they also start looking at the National Socialist Party, which of course is the Nazis. And this is what happens when there's such a bad economic situation. If any party gets remotely into power and starts presenting solutions that seem to work, people are going to vote for them, right? You need to feed your family. You need to work. You need to provide a roof over their heads. And of course, everyone's promising this. And this is not necessarily to go into the transition from the Weimar Republic into, Nazi-controlled Germany, but it's the Weimar Republic and the way it's set up that allows the National Socialists to take power. Remember, you know what? Let me rephrase that. The National Socialists do not take power. This is something that is very much a misnomer. Hitler doesn't take over. They're elected, they're duly elected according to the legal and legitimate electoral processes of the Weimar Republic, right? They don't seize power. They are voted into office by the electorate, and eventually there are enough representatives of the National Socialists and the Nazis that get into the Reichstag that they then begin to vote, as we would say in Star Wars, emergency powers to the Chancellor, right? And then they name Hitler as Chancellor, and then they vote him powers, and then an emergency is declared, and he's given certain powers, and there they go. They're off to the races, by 1933, and then moving on from that point into the mid and later 30s. They do turn the economy around. It's difficult to argue with that, but there's a lot of things that go along with that.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
that's the Weimar Republic. That's Glenn's take on it. If you want, this is very rare. Not a lot of stuff comes out about stories from the Weimar Republic. But if you're interested, for you adults out there, this is certainly not a kids program, but there is a series on Netflix now that was actually made in Germany called Babylon Berlin. That is I think they're on season 3 now. The production quality is excellent, and it is a fantastic story set in those, late 20s, early 30s in Berlin, in Germany. It's in German, so you got to read the subtitles. If that bugs you, it may not be for you, but I highly recommend it. Again, it's for the adults out there.
Yeah.
Not for the little ones.
Well, thank you. I hope that helps you, Fried, with your British
Fried
friend.
Fried knew the answer to that. He was just trying to find a good way to explain it to the monarchist.
Yeah. So, Marie, when it comes to World War II, are there things that you were surprised to learn in your studies of World War II that you came across? Maybe things that you didn't learn in high school, but it took a while, or anything that you want to share about World War II?
I actually had a fantastic. We didn't really cover World War II that much in my high school. Mm-hmm. I don't remember it that much. I think we glossed over it because it's near the end of American history, right?
Right. Here's Pearl Harbor. Here's D-Day. Here's Anne Frank. Then we win.
Yeah.
On to Vietnam.
Yeah.
Yes. I'm not even sure, because I took AP US History in high school, and I'm not even sure if we got there, to be quite honest.
Oh,
but
wow. Yeah.
I had a fantastic middle school teacher that we called Coach Roby, and that man loved World War II. And everything I know about World War II stems from Coach Roby. And, he brought in, of course, they were safe, grenades.
Sure.
He collected money from Germany during that time. Mm-hmm. Ration books, helmets, stuff. He collected all this, these antiques, and then he would bring them to his 7th grade classroom and pass them around. And his PowerPoints were fantastic. And he included things where he was like, okay, so this isn't going to be on the test, but we're going to talk about it still.
Yeah.
Yeah, that kind of teacher. And it was good
Aww.
Stuff. It was
That's
good
awesome.
stuff. So he also had us, for extra credit, learn how to count to 9 in German. or 9 or 10 in German.
Nice.
Just, interesting things that, I still kind of know. I'm sorry, I don't think I can still do it. But
yeah, right. But yeah, having I think that's a really cool part of what we do here with our on-site programs, and this family day. Even though it's going to be virtual, you're still going to get really up and close with some items that represent the home front, which is going to be really cool too.
Obviously, we're big fans of teaching with objects.
Yes.
and like you said, when you're passing around, say, a German helmet, and it enters your 7th grade hands, and he says, "This is a real helmet. Someone wore this."
Yeah.
And you're like, "Wow!" Just to hold it, touch it, see it.
Yeah, it definitely makes an impression.
Yeah.
And also my grandfather fought in World War II.
Oh, wow.
So he was actually a Marine in World War II.
Oh dear. Yes.
Very cool.
So I also have, talking with him, and also his accounts that we wrote down my grandmother wrote down.
Oh, that's great that you have those preserved. That's awesome.
And also his stuff from World War II.
Yeah.
Yeah. Karen is asking about the uniforms, asking, why did the Army just go back to the World War II era uniform style and brown color? I don't know if they mean literally just recently. I haven't heard about that.
They did. Yeah. Do you know about this?
I saw it. No,
Yeah.
I read an article about it,
So there has the U.S. Army since Vietnam has been struggling to find not acceptance. They want to find a dress uniform that they can embrace and that they can call their own, right? And the Marines have had their dress blues for forever. The Air Force is new enough; they more or less have the same thing. And the Navy's the home of tradition. Those uniforms have stayed the same, but the Army has been trying to find its way ever since Vietnam. And they've gone through several different iterations of what the dress uniform should be. And, for 30 years, they had 30 plus, they had a green uniform, right? It was Army green, but it was a business suit, right? With a tie and a coat and the pockets and everything. And they would have their decorations on it, but it was a business suit. And there was a lot of call for the Army to get back to its roots, to have they wanted people to have a sense of pride when they wore this uniform. And they conducted surveys and they did research. And as it turns out, a lot of people harken back to World War II. That classic, as the officers say, the pinks and greens, or the tan, the tan stuff, the dark brown coats, the light brown pants and things like that. So the U.S. Army has been working on that, and I think it was just last year that they officially adopted that. And that's the reason, to get back that sense of tradition and to instill a sense of pride and of continuity in those Army traditions. I mean, there's there's no way you can argue that World War II wasn't the penultimate military triumph of the nation and of all of its armed services. And so having that uniform is going to be a physical connection and reminder when those people wear it that they are part of a very proud, very strong tradition. And they do look pretty good.
Yeah, I think they look really cool.
Yeah.
So we earlier today when we were filming for our family day, we were talking about the home front, and part of the conversation that we didn't get to finish was about those who actually opposed war in World War II, and I feel like that perspective isn't really talked about a whole lot. And I don't personally know a whole lot about it. Could y'all share what you know about folks who were not so keen on joining the war?
Yes.
Take it away,
They
Glenn.
didn't want to.
They didn't want to.
So, again, going back to World War I, America had held off getting involved in that war until it felt that it couldn't for a variety of different reasons. It enters the war. It puts some men and resources into the war, and then it's done. And then the United States sinks back into an isolationist, perspective, inward-looking, trying not to get involved in external politics and foreign affairs and things like that. And when when does World War II start? That's a conversation that's more complicated, and we've talked about that before. But as things begin to develop in both the Pacific and in Europe, with the expansion of Germany and the totalitarian government and the things that they're taking the Sudetenland and Czechoslovakia, and they're moving into Austria and things like that, a lot of the Western powers in Europe are not interested in trying to stop Hitler because they just lost millions of men one generation ago trying to stop the Germans in World War I. So they're not interested in it. America's not interested in it because we're isolationist. So even as the war progresses, even when Germany and France get pulled into the war, there is a strong feeling in America that this is a European affair. We don't need to get involved in this again. Let them slaughter themselves for the second time in a generation. We're the new world. We don't need to get involved in that. And they had those anti-war, anti-involvement people had a very, very popular spokesman in the person of Charles Lindbergh, right? Charles Lindbergh, who was the first person to fly solo across the Atlantic. He was very, very much an anti-interventionist. And we've got, when we were going through the box, oh goodness, today, getting ready for Family Day, I had forgotten that I have like a couple of books and some pamphlets that are like, don't get involved over there. Let them fight their own wars. And there was a very strong anti-interventionist movement until Pearl Harbor. When Pearl Harbor happens, the sneak attack, out of the blue, thing, and then that galvanizes the country because it's very different from going to intervene in something that looks like a foreign war to defending yourself after you've been attacked. And so those are two very different things, and it was that attack on Pearl Harbor that immediately sort of unified and set the course for the great majority of Americans to win through, as FDR said, to absolute victory. So that's, but you're right, Lib. It's very interesting. There's a lot of interesting literature on the anti-interventionist, and some of the anti-interventionists, one small sect was the German-American Bund, which was in effect the American Nazi Party.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I didn't realize there was an American Nazi Party during World War II.
Well, before.
Right.
Especially in the 30s, right?
Yeah.
Because we're not at war with them yet. And they had the armbands, they had the brown shirts, they had the rallies, they had the strong speeches and all this sort of stuff. And they were like, Germany's doing right, and Britain and France are old, corrupt countries. Let Germany do its thing. And for a while, there were people that, especially those of German descent, who got swept up in that. And if you're an anti-interventionist, you might be swept up in that too. But then when they got a little bit into it, like, ooh, I'm reading some bad things about the Nazis in Europe. Maybe I don't want this brown shirt. Maybe I should take this to the Goodwill or sell it, down at the market. We're not really interested in this anymore. So by the time of Pearl Harbor, it had pretty much died out almost on its own. But there for a while, there were several thousand people involved in that.
Wow.
I think to answer your question further, Liva, the most startling thing I think I realized during World War II is there is a photo from that small segment of people in the 1930s, and I think they rented out Madison Square Garden, and it's just covered in swastikas.
In American brown shirts, yeah.
Yeah.
Which was, I think, startling because I realized, that's in America?
Yeah. Ooh, is that Berlin or... No, that's New York.
Yeah, it didn't really dawn on me, the perception, from my perception, it's just like Nazis have always been bad.
Right.
But, prior to World War II, or just, when they were just starting out, they were just another political party.
Yeah,
So,
kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
And don't get us wrong, folks. We're just...
Nazis are bad.
Nazis are bad, but this is
Official
something that happens. You'll probably eventually get this too, Marie, but when you go to graduate school and you get your graduate degree in history, they take you into a room and they turn off all the lights and they cut out the part of you that judges the past from a moral perspective, and they tell you, you can have this back when you prove to us that you can be totally subjective in your totally objective in your study of history. And you're like, yes. Nazis, good economic plan. Hitler made the Autobahn. How admirable. Times Man of the Year. And then when you can do that, they give it back and you go, ooh, did I say all that? And it's like, well, you had to get your degree.
Wait, did you say Hitler was Times Man of the Year?
Yes, he was, 1938.
What? I did not know that. That is nuts. Wow. That's crazy.
Because, and see, this is the other, and I had discussed this too in one of my classes, that if Hitler had died in 1938, he may have gone down in history as one of the greatest Europeans ever.
Wow.
Because it's pre-Holocaust. He's pulled Germany and a lot of Europe out of economic depression. He's built the Autobahn. He's rebuilt industry. He's made Germany strong again. He's united the country in this single political vision. And then he dies. That's it. Wow. That's great. But the dude
I think there's all of World War II.
He just had to keep going, though, didn't he?
Wow.
It's interesting.
That is fascinating. And that's a great example of the complexities of what, like you were saying, how you really have to look at things objectively to learn all those details.
1 second rule of history.
Yeah.
Everything's complicated.
Wow.
What's the first rule?
Do not judge the past, understand it.
How many rules of Glenn's rules of
I've
history
only got 3 or 4, but they're really important.
What's the third one?
We'll make a video about
it. The third one is never lose a war.
Okay. Yes. Rules of history.
Yes.
I love it. So, Marie, can you tell us a little bit about, the fact that women are coming into the workforce during World War II has always really fascinated me. But what were typical jobs that women would have had prior to World War II, and then what were the new jobs that women were kind of had to take the place of?
So this also sounds bad, but war is usually good for women, because men go off and then women have to do all the home front stuff and the jobs that the men were doing at home, and they prove themselves that hey, I can also work on assembly line.
War accelerates social change.
It does. So when you have the American Civil War, you have women who are then running their homes more or less than because the men are gone, and farms, and so going into factory work, which they have already been in. They've been in factory work for a long time, and then you have World War I, and World War I is really where you have a lot of women, when you think of gender roles and you think of more gendered professions, perhaps, sometimes school teachers, nurses. We generally think of today, when you think gender stereotypes, as being female, and that's really started in World War I, right after World War I. because all the men were away and women became more school teachers and more nurses.
So before World War I, it was more typical for a male
Yes,
teacher?
you would have male teachers and male nurses.
Okay.
And that's pretty much all that there was.
Oh.
It wasn't really... Of course, you had Florence Nightingale back into the Crimea. So there were female nurses. There have been, especially since Florence Nightingale. But this is where you have women more entering and actually getting paid.
Oh, but professions.
In their professions. Not
Not just jobs, they're professions.
Exactly. So that's where you have them more entering the professions. And even today, you can still kind of see, and I know I experienced this and I just got out of school, you have more and more perhaps female teachers going like in younger grades, and then they go up and they get more and more male, or there are more, and that also is part of World War I and World War II. When people came back, more of the men got their like higher degree, higher education, like high school, college jobs back, and the women stayed in the more elementary positions. So effects of World War I and World War II that we have still with us today. In World War II, and after World War I, you also have more secretarial work, but I think secretarial work really took off as a boom for women right after World War II, is when women became more secretaries, and if you think Mad Men, like
right,
all those ladies.
Well, and then before, post World War I, pre World War II, there's a lot of office machinery that come in that I don't know if it's real or if it's just the perception of the times, but women tended to do those things better, right? Telephone switchboards, typewriters, dictaphones, things like that. They're very detail oriented. They're very machine oriented, and they could pick up on that.
And during World War II, there you have the Rosies, the Rosie the Riveter, women going to work in the factories. But after World War II, they're kind of told to go home. Like, hey, the men are coming back, the men need jobs, you should go home again. And there were a lot of women who liked the independence that having their own income gave them from having these jobs in these factories. And they didn't want to, but they were kind of like fired, so they had to go. They're just like, shoo, you did your good job, you did it when we needed you to, now go back home, be a good wife. And they were like, but I want more than just that. So then you have really the second wave of feminism that comes out of that, and the feminine mystique, and women gaining more places just in the workforce as a normal thing. College
enrollment grows by leaps and bounds for females. Some of them are eligible for the GI Bill. The ones that had been in the WACs and the waves and things like that. But it's interesting too that also, the war helped break down a lot of the racial barriers as well, because, and this is fascinating, I went to look at, I was specifically looking at Atlanta newspapers, but I'm pretty sure this would be the same across the South. When you look at want ads pre-war for, females, it's and they were segregated. The want ads were set, white male, black male, white female, black female. So white males there were want ads for everything. Black males, the want ads were pretty much for manual labor, farm labor, janitorial, moving boxes, things like that. White female, it was nurses, secretary, and phone operator, things like that, office jobs, teacher. Black female, it was almost totally household servant. It was service industry. It was maids, cooks, things like that. And you look at it, it's pretty consistent. When World War II starts, you start to see those job listings fundamentally change. And you start to see, at first they're still segregated, but the black men are said, well, now we're actually looking for factory work. We're looking for welders. We're looking for assemblers. And then the white women are also said, looking for welders, we'll train, looking for rivet, looking for, and then even the black women, and at the height of World War II, it's really just want ads, right? Because it was de facto segregation, or excuse me, de facto desegregation that was starting to take place. And, because they're just needing people in the factories, because so many men are going in the military, they're just come on, you don't know anything about welding? We'll train you. Don't worry about it. Just come on in.
Get in the door.
Just get in the door. And so it really opened up a lot of opportunities. And like you say, so many, World War I was not a critical mass of numbers.
No.
World War II was a critical mass in terms of racial and gender, traditional racial and gender roles and issues. And after that, like you say, it gave rise to the second wave of feminism. Mm-hmm. So I'm one of those people that argue that it gave rise to the modern civil rights movement. Mm. We think of Martin Luther King in the 60s, but it had its roots in the experiences of tens of thousands of African Americans in World War II. They would go overseas, and they go into areas like in England and in France where clubs and restaurants and pubs are not segregated.
Oh yeah.
And then they're treated differently by their own military. They're treated better by civilian populations than their own military, where they're fighting against the idea of racial superiority. And then they go home, and then they have to begin that struggle anew in their own land. And it just feeds on itself until you do get to the 60s.
That's a really cool connection that I haven't made. That when they're going overseas, they're going to experience a totally different social culture, and the connection of they're watching another group that is oppressed,
right?
And they're fighting against that oppression, but then they're facing their own type of oppression at home. Wow, that's really fascinating. So it looks like we, folks, if you have any questions for us, we can take questions about anything in history, but we are diving into World War II as of right now. But feel free to chat any questions. One popped into my head, though, because when you were talking about, Glenn, when you were talking about earlier today, like victory gardens and the way that people, Fried says, I can come up with questions if you want me to.
Do it!
Sure, yeah. Do it, Fried. Yeah, be one of our co-hosts.
Stump me.
Yeah, right. Try to stump Glenn. But, as historians, I'm wondering, are there any things that you thought were really good ideas during this time when it came to conservation, growing your own food, all the types of skills that one on the home front might need to learn, that it'd be cool if when you were talking about victory gardens and had that manual from World War II, I was like, well, that sounds pretty nifty. Maybe I'll take a look and learn how to garden.
I think the trick with us modern folks in gardening is time.
Yeah.
Right? Because putting a garden in the ground, you can't just put seeds in, water it once a day, and then expect to have tomatoes and corn and beans in 5 or 6 months. It takes daily attention. And we have a lot of things pulling our attention away today, both legitimate and sometimes frivolous, let's be honest.
Yes.
But there's, having a garden. And again, some of those victory gardens that people were encouraged to have were just little boxes they would hang up next to a window for tomatoes. And just being able to grow something, I think, it's World War II really is an interesting crux in American history, not just on the grand scope of the international scale of the United States becoming an atomic superpower, but in terms of how our society changes. In the 1930s, even in urban areas, there's still a lot of basic traditional activities and gender roles and things that are going on. People know, they probably grew up on a farm and they know how to grow vegetables or to work with chickens. The women are going to know how to buy a pattern and sew a dress and things like that. And they hadn't been to the big city, and they hadn't met a lot of different people from, generally speaking, this is a generalization, from where they had grown up. And I like to bring up the example of, my grandparents. Three sisters married 2 brothers and a first cousin, right, up in Fannin County. And my grandmother was one of the sisters, and my grandfather was one of the brothers. And they all got married right before the war, and when the war happened, they were building a gigantic Bell bomber plant down in Marietta, south of here, and they all left. They were dirt poor rural folks, okay, just out of the Depression, and they came down to the big city, and they got a job working on the most technologically advanced piece of machinery in the world at the time, with people who had come from all over the state and in some ways all over the country to work on this plane. And they met people and they lived in the big city and they learned how restaurants worked and public transportation. And I mean, it's things we take for granted today, but they're experiencing these things. And now when the war's over, they all 6 do go back to Fannin County and they start to raise their family there, but they've seen a wider world, right? They've experienced things that their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents could not imagine.
Yeah.
And so they, even if they're going back to little old Fannin County, they have a different perspective on the world and what's in it. And I think that also is a fundamental shift in the American psyche and identity of itself. And again, that's just a small local example, but that happened all over the country, that sort of thing.
And then you have all those men who might not have, again, going from the Depression, getting, fighting their way through that, and then going all the way to the other side of the world in many cases, and experiencing total new cultures that way too.
Right.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, war is also this vessel of learning and a chance to actually see the world despite the risk.
It kind of is. And a lot of people signed up for the military for the adventure. We think of, not to start harping on another war, but we've talked about, how World War I, we all think of it as this awful, depressing waste of human life. And that's greatly influenced by that war poetry that's just depressing and everything's bad and everything was lost and no good came of this whatsoever. And as a couple of historians have pointed out, and this really made an impact on me and it made me look at it further, you have to remember that some folks who experience war actually enjoy it. They consider it one of the greatest living moments that they've ever had, right? It's an experience unlike any other. And I don't say, they don't run around in circles and clap their hands and say, yay, this is fun. But the experience, even while they're in the midst of it, they consider to be one of those self-defining moments to the point that they don't see how anything could be better is not the word, more alive.
Yeah.
They realize they'll never be more alive than they are in that environment.
Yeah, right. I mean, it takes you back to your most basic instincts in a way,
right?
And adrenaline.
I think it works that way for societies too.
Yeah, right.
It really hones in what's important, what a society can accomplish, what the priorities are, and segregation was incredibly important in the South in 1940. But when it came time to beat the Germans and the Japanese, suddenly segregation could start being pushed to the side to ensure victory. So
right. Let's see, we got 2 questions. One, taking a shift away from World War II, Fried asks, was Napoleon a force for good in the end? Might have killed millions, but spread modern government across Europe and kicked off a lot of events that led to nation states and democracy. So another complex figure. So in your opinion, Glenn and Marie, was Napoleon ultimately a force for good?
Yes, Marie?
I don't know that much about Napoleon to where I don't feel like I can give an important answer.
Gotcha. Yeah. Well, qualify your answer.
Oh. So let me back into the answer.
Yeah.
A lot of modern people, especially in Britain and some of the other European countries, tend to draw the comparison between Napoleon and Hitler, and they kind of put them into the same bucket. They rose to preeminence in a revolutionary period, and they asserted their will upon an entire nation and used that nation as a tool to conquer other areas and expand their worldview, and they had to be stopped by coalitions that saw them for the evil that they were, and they were eventually crushed and removed from the face of humanity. They put them in the same bucket, but they're 2 very, very different people. They're two very, very different times of history, and everyone who does that has to look at Napoleon by looking through Hitler when you look back in time, right? You're looking through the Hitler lens to get at Napoleon. And I don't think that's fair. I don't think, not only is it not fair, I don't think it gives you the best picture of Napoleon. Napoleon was not bent on genocide. He may have been bent on European domination, but who isn't, right? And he was a genius, and as Fried pointed out, he does everywhere. He creates a force for a democratic approach, for the emphasis of the individual over the state, which had certainly not been the case in Bourbon France.
Yeah.
And he does expand his ideas of unified law codes and of maybe not democracy per se, but at least republican governments everywhere that they went, which is why he was able to get support from so many places for so long. Now, like every incredibly successful person trying to conquer the world or even Europe, they tend to go too far and they don't know when to stop, right? And they hack off a lot of people in the process. So I guess, was he a force for good? I don't know, but he most certainly was not a force of evil, in my opinion, not remotely. I think Napoleon was simply Napoleon, and he was an incredibly talented, incredibly insightful, far-seeing person who happened to be able to use those talents and that vision in the right place at the right time that gave rise to a remarkable period in European history. And it really was a reaction to what had been going on in France with the incredibly oppressive French crown and aristocracy for centuries, right? Some people have argued that's why the French Revolution was so violent compared to ours. We'd never really been oppressed, right, in the colonies. And we had only been under a pressuring monarchical government for really about 10 years after the French and Indian War. France, the people of France had been under that heel for hundreds and hundreds of years. It was bad. So, that, as what was it I think Thomas Jefferson said, and I'm paraphrasing here, a nation cannot be carried from tyranny to freedom on a feather pillow.
I like that. Let's see. Hat Mouse is with us. And
Hat Mouse!
Yeah, hello. They say, I was watching a Japanese movie from the 1950s, and the costuming for the movie was interesting because sometimes they dressed in contemporary Western clothing, and other times when they were at home or at a funeral, they would wear more traditional Japanese clothing. Some of the poor women in the movie wear traditional Japanese clothing, but most of the characters dressed traditionally Western. When did Japan begin to adopt suits and ties and dresses? That's a good question.
1870s and 80s, actually.
And is that just because of more trade and such?
Do you know about the Meiji reign and stuff like that? So, Japan, very organized, very disciplined society, wanted to take its place on the world stage as an equal power amongst the European powers. Like I said, they were disciplined enough, they were organized enough. The one thing they were kind of lacking was technological parity with the West, especially England and France, and of course the United States. And so there was a movement beginning in the 1860s and pushing on up into the 1890s, where there were two forces in Japan. There were the ones who wanted to modernize and take on the role of a modern imperial power. They felt that meant adopting the methods, the technologies, the appearance of modern imperial powers. So that's when you start to see them adopting, learning English. They're adopting Western clothing. They're adopting Western military practices, techniques, technologies breech-loading rifles and cannons and things like that. There's another segment of Japanese society, and that wants to remain focused on the traditional Japanese lifestyle, the clothing, the sense of feudal hierarchy, the weaponry, and just the mindset. And those two forces very much are a matter of friction within Japan's government and Japan's society for a few decades. And the emperor, of course, as always, is trying to keep above it and try to keep the peace. Long story short, the pro-Western forces do eventually succeed because they begin to create a Japanese army that is trained with firearms and cannons, and they begin to build modern naval ships, still-hold ships with breech-loading, long-range guns. And so they do eventually press out the political influence of those traditional forces, but the societal and cultural impact of those traditional forces remains, which is why, like Hat Mouse, you were talking about, in the movie, when they're out doing business and things like that, they're in Western-style suits, but when they're doing something that's traditionally cultural, like funerals or weddings or things like that, they're going to wear the traditional dress. And to a certain extent, some families in Japan still do that today. If you see a marriage or a funeral or something like that, they're still going to wear that type of clothing. Japan is as I'm sure you know, Japan is a very, very interesting place. It's a very interesting cultural mix of a lot of different things. They somehow retain their Japanese-ness and yet have adopted so many Western traits that they're just fun to watch.
Yeah,
they really are.
Especially depicted in the movies. I'm sure that was also probably a big part of people actually seeing Japanese culture be that.
Yes.
Have that diversity in it. So it's pretty cool. Thank you, Hat Mouse. We have a question from Wendy and Olivia, one of our big fans. Hey, Olivia. Olivia tells Fried that Chinese history is Glenn's weakness. So Fried, now you know. So now you know Glenn's weakness. Start studying, Glenn. But Wendy asks, she says, I was wondering if you could talk about the Red Scare, when and where. I don't know much about this either, but I think this will be probably our last question for the day. If you want to enlighten us on the Red Scare.
There were actually two.
Oh, okay.
There were actually two. According to the history books, we like to organize things in very chronological. Yes, timeline and chronological and nice little neat things. So the first Red Scare actually took place after World War I, when, because of the chaos of a post-World War I Europe, you have to remember that a lot of nations and empires and centuries-old monarchies were gone. Russia,
predominantly,
gone. Austro-Hungary, gone. Right? Ottoman Empire, as far as a monarchical state, gone. It just and the ones that survived, like Germany, right? The Germany monarchy, gone. British very much under threat, even though it had survived. World War I totally shifts the way people think about how Europe should be organized. It's the monarchs that got us into this mess in the first place. And so you start to see a lot of reactive forces that try to create a better world that will prevent another great war like they had just had. And one of those ideas was communism, right? Because the communists had taken over in the former Russian state. It's the Soviet Union by 1918, 1920. But that seems to be a rising tide. And so in all the European countries, in Germany, in France, in Italy, in the former Austro-Hungarian Empire, Austria and Hungary, there are huge bodies of communists who are trying to either legally through elective process or through subversion and revolution take over the governments. There's also this force in Great Britain that's trying to bring down the crown. And so this carries over to the United States, where it's a little bit easier actually for it to get a toehold because the United States is already considerably more liberal, small L liberal, in terms of government and political philosophy than a lot of the European countries. And so this post-World War I Red Scare sees a lot of people afraid that, well, if the communists are taking over in Europe, they're going to come here and they're going to start taking over. And it wasn't quite as bad as the there weren't that many communists coming to take over in this time period, but it was enough to scare people, to make them afraid. There are two guys, Franco and Vanzetti, who were accused of crimes, and because they were connected, or at least found to be connected, to possible communist sympathizers and conspirators, their trial was a sham, and they were executed post-haste after being found guilty. That's one of those things from the Red Scare. And then it kind of calms down when people realize the communists are not actually going to be able to manage a takeover out in the United States. And things go along as one would expect until you get to the post-World War II world, and especially moving into the 50s, and especially the late 50s and the early 60s. It's the height of the Cold War, right? Now, it's not just communist subversives. There's an actual gigantic red blob on the map that is the entire Soviet Union and, by the late 50s, all of China. See, I do know a little bit about China. And from the American perspective, they don't see or they don't know about the conflict between those two communist powers. All they see and what they hear, based on the public relations of those two countries, is that we're all one big happy communist family. And when you look at a map, when you crush the Soviet Union and China together, that's what, a fifth of the globe? A fourth or a fifth of the globe? That is a serious danger to your way of life, to political stability in Europe. And they're already saying, our goal is to communize the rest of the world. And so we have that huge force overseas, as well as the scare of possible communist operatives in the United States, which is when you get the House Un-American Activities Committee, when they're bringing actors and things who might have been involved with not even only communist, but socialist movements. There were people who went to fight against fascist Franco in Spain who were hauled before it because they were preemptive anti-fascist. They were anti-fascist before they were supposed to be anti-fascist. Wow. Folks like the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, those who went over to fight in the Spanish Civil War. You get, and then you get folks like McCarthy, who comes up with these numbers and these, public policy statements that don't make any sense. I have proof here that almost 1/3 of the American government is communist or communist-influenced people. They're secret cells. And someone would say, well, can I see that sheet? No! And then the numbers would change. And so this contributed greatly to that idea of, free world versus communist world. And the duality of that drove American politics for a great long time. And of course, the problem was, it was a great exaggeration, but there were communist spies in the United States. There were people trying to infiltrate the military and the scientific community. But because McCarthy went so far over the top that he made it a joke, they actually couldn't pursue the ones that were actually in there trying to do things. So it's an interesting thing. So yeah, the two Red Scares, I think, are great examples of how political ideology can get a lot of America and its government whipped into a fury over a threat that may not actually be there. And of course, McCarthyism has come to be a byword for an overblown attack on a particular stance or a particular ideology or something like that. But again, the secret complicated surprise is that sometimes he was right. 2% of the time he was right about the communists.
Very small percentage.
It's a very small percentage.
I mean, was there ever any documented actual significant threat or plans by communists in the United States?
Some were uncovered, but it wasn't through anything that McCarthy did.
Right. Okay.
It was like the Rosenthal spy ring, right? That were sending atomic secrets to the Soviets. That was uncovered. That's how the Soviets under Stalin were able to build their atomic bomb so quickly, because there were spies in the atomic community sending them the secrets and that last part of the equation that they couldn't quite figure out, how to make the uranium or the plutonium, and they got that, and the United States was shocked at how quickly the Soviets were able to create an atomic weapon, and it led to suspicion that proved, legitimate. So there were spies and agents at play in a lot of different places in the military scientific community, and some in the government, but nothing that McCarthy himself actually uncovered.
Wow. Well, I hope that answered your question, Wendy, and thank you for joining us, Olivia, as well. Thanks to everyone who's joined us. It's great to see more people joining us for Lo-Fi History. We're on Facebook Live, YouTube Live, and Twitch. This originally started out as kind of an experiment on Twitch, and I'm glad that folks are enjoying it. We'll be here next Tuesday at 4 p.m., but before then, we have our live stream tomorrow with Marie, who is going to present on Louisa May Alcott, the author of Little Women. Very much looking forward to that. That's going to be at 2 p.m. Eastern on Facebook Live and YouTube Live. And then this Friday, we have our members-only live stream, which is going to be a guided tour of the White Path Cabin with Glenn. That is our 18th century cabin here on the premises of the History Center. So you'll actually get to learn about the architecture and how it's interpreted at the History Center. So lots of cool information there. And then on Sunday from 1 p.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern, we have our virtual World War II Family Day. Marie, do you want to tell us what we're going to learn about?
Yeah, so Glenn is going to talk about early war America, American soldiers, and also late war American soldiers, going through a whole box of home front memorabilia.
Turns out I only made it about a third of the way through.
Oh, only a third. Oh, wow. Okay. He's going to try to get you to
That's a lot of stuff. I tend to talk.
You?
No.
Libba is going to be singing some classics that were sung at USO shows. We are also going to be hearing from a Rosie the Riveter. And then we will also have World War II trivia. So be sure to stay tuned for all of that, which is coming this Sunday. Please join us for that as well.
Yes.
And the programs, the segments start at the top of each hour. Is that right?
That's right. So from 1 to 5 p.m. At 5 p.m. we'll have our live virtual trivia. So you can join on Facebook Live and YouTube Live for all of those programs. And you could win a digital membership if you win our trivia on Sunday. Yes. So thanks again for joining us. We will see you next Tuesday with more Lo-Fi History.
Yay.
Take care.
Bye.